Do you have hope that he'll be able to change for good?
Yeah. I mean, if I'm being totally honest, I just feel like there's no relationship left to men. He was gone in the times of my life that I needed him most. I was growing up, and I needed a fatherly figure, and I didn't have one.
One of my earliest memories was of trying to wake up one of my relatives and not being able to. And obviously I didn't understand why when I was so small, but as I got older, I realized we had drug addiction in my family.
My dad spends a lot of time at work. He spends a lot of time eating, watching TV. He's basically a couch potato. He doesn't have any hobbies or anything that are productive to have him go out and do something.
We created a society where just lots of people don't want to be present in their lives.
My father does not have many friends.
We live in a very unnatural way with people being massively cut off from each other.
Just looking at him and how he acts, I don't think he thinks he has a purpose other than going to work and being a part of the income.
And also this kind of empty, materialist way we're taught to think about ourselves. We're trained to seek meaning in things that we all know at some level don't give you any meaning.
I don't think he has any enjoyment in his life because it's the same repetitive cycle every day. And what enjoyment is there in not having change?
We're trained from the moment we're born by advertising, by the whole culture we live in, to think that the solution to our problems comes from buying and consuming things. Meaningless materialist distractions to dominate our consciousness. And I think it's one of the reasons why we're so unhappy.
I feel like he probably doesn't like his life that way, and I think that's probably one of the reasons he turned to drinking is because he didn't have anybody to listen to his problems, and I think they were kind of swirling around inside of his head and haunting him. So to mute those agonizing sounds of all those stresses in his life, he would turn to alcohol.
A really key aspect of addiction is not wanting to be present in your life, not finding your life bearable.
Addiction, Bonding, Part 2.
Oftentimes, something that needs transcending creates a chasm in our life because it's just too big. On this side of the chasm might be exhaustion from a long or profound struggle.
Or pain that's been numbed due to self-preservation because the hope has just faded away that things could be different. Perhaps we don't even see that chasm anymore because we've shut our eyes to it.
We no longer even attempt to ponder what it could take to cross the gap because it feels utterly impassable. But there still remains that thing that needs to be transcended, right?
So when we're ready to leave our side of the chasm with its pain or blaming or lambasting or berating, when we're ready to attempt the daunting journey down the path to the other side, where acceptance and understanding and possibly even freedom await.
Well, research, data, and experience are often useful gear to have in your pack.
This is part 2 of a 3-part series on addiction that's exploring 3 different perspectives, 3 different paths. It's important to note that there really is no right path to the other side.
For today's journey, we've enlisted the help of Eric Zimmer of the One You Feed podcast.
He interviewed an incredible writer, researcher, and journalist from the UK named Johann Hari.
It's a century since we made this really fateful decision to take addicts and punish them and make them suffer because we believed that would deter them, it would give them an incentive to stop.
Johann Hari is a successful TED Talk presenter and author of the book Chasing the Scream.
When we heard the brilliance of Eric's original episode from May 2015 and the radically different perspective Johann is offering the world, we knew we had to incorporate it for this series on addiction.
You heard a few of Johann's thoughts at the beginning of this episode, along with our young storyteller from part 1. This is Johann Hari.
I thought of myself as someone who knew a lot about this subject.
Johann was introduced to addiction as a young child because a family member was afflicted by it, and later through working as a newspaper journalist.
I'd written about it for a long time. Obviously, I'd, cared about it because of my family, but
He realized there were a lot of really basic questions he just didn't know the answers to.
like, what really causes drug use and drug addiction? One of the things I really learned is that almost everything we think we know about this subject is wrong. Drugs aren't what we think they are. Addiction isn't what we think it is.
Isn't addiction simply drugs or behaviors that take us over to the point where we can't control it anymore?
Well,
If you had said to me 4 years ago, what causes, say, heroin addiction? I think I might have looked at you like you were a little bit simple-minded, and I would have said, well, heroin causes heroin addiction, right? It's pretty obvious. We've been told a story for 100 years about drugs and addiction that's just become like, our common sense, right? It's kind of obvious.
So if you, Cheryl, and I, and all 20 of our hardcore listener fans use heroin for 20 days, on day 21 we'd all be heroin addicts, right?
Because there's chemical hooks in the drug that our bodies would start to physically need.
And by day 21,
We would be craving the drug, and that's what addiction is. That's certainly the story I believed.
so where does the story begin exactly?
Well, that pill should be kicking in right about now, is it?
Yeah,
Isn't
I
it?
can feel it.
Oh,
I can
yeah.
feel it.
You know what you can feel? You can feel like you leaving your body.
It feels like I got leaving my body.
There's never been a human society where people haven't sought out intoxicants.
All right, here we go.
at the Temple of Eleusis, about 40 miles outside of Athens, people would throw these huge parties more than 2,000 years ago and drink what we now know was a hallucinogenic drink.
It sounds an awful lot like Burning Man.
And the desire for intoxication isn't just in adults.
You think about a little kid. All children, this has been studied, all kids at some point in their development will spin round and round and round and make themselves dizzy, even though they know it will make themselves sick, because they want a slightly altered headspace.
That impulse for altered reality runs really deep in us, and it's not just there in humans. Johann interviewed
An absolutely fascinating scientist called Ronald K. Siegel who spent 30 years struggling how animals use drugs. And it turns out most animal species are like us. They just love getting intoxicated for the fun of it. The little birds will drink fermented berries and it'll make them drunk and they'll fly around a little bit crazy. Catnip is a drug for cats.
And what about mongooses, you might ask? Well, Siegel also studied mongooses and found that when hallucinogenic plants were kept in their pen, they would munch on the plants a little, start twitching, and wander around disoriented. But then they just didn't use the plants again. They didn't like them. Now, what happens when you add stress to the mix?
well,
One day a tropical storm hit Hawaii and the pen where he kept the mongooses was kind of wrecked. And one of the mongooses died. Mongooses are apparently monogamous, so they pair off. And this mongoose looked at its dead partner and went off and chewed loads of the hallucinogenic plants, pretty clearly because it wanted to just not be present. It wanted to get out of it. It was distressed.
and a similar response to stress was found in water buffalo in Vietnam. Prior to the Vietnam War, opium plants used to grow naturally in the wild, and water buffalo roamed freely in a lot of the same areas. But they just didn't eat the opium plants.
But when the bombing started, when the American attack on Vietnam began, the water buffalo did start to eat huge amounts of the opium plants. They obviously were trying to kind of calm themselves down.
So addiction comes from our need to stay calm?
Well, let's not jump to conclusions just yet. Next, Johann finds himself in Vancouver, Canada, with
An extraordinary man, a professor of psychology called Bruce Alexander. Bruce explained to me that The idea of addiction that I had in my head, that most of us have in our heads, comes from a series of experiments that were done earlier in the 20th century.
These experiments put a rat in a cage with 2 water bottles. One bottle was just plain water, and the other was laced with either cocaine or heroin. When it's just one rat kept alone in a cage with access to drug water, the rat is almost always going to prefer the drugged water, and almost always it will kill itself quite quickly by overdosing. And then
Bruce comes along in the 70s and says, hang on a minute, we're putting the rat in an empty cage. It's got nothing to do except use these drugs. Let's do this differently. So Bruce built Rat Park, which is an alternative cage. And Rat Park is basically heaven for rats.
Rat Park has everything a rat could want. Cheese, colored balls to play with, tunnels to explore, it has loads of friends, it can have lots of sex if it wants to. It still has both water bottles, the drugged water and the regular water.
But here's the fascinating thing. In Rat Park, the rats don't like the drugged water. They hardly ever drink it. None of them ever use it compulsively. None of them ever overdose.
Free access to unlimited amounts of cocaine or heroin, and none of the rats drank themselves to death? But I wonder if that would work the same in people. I mean, not putting them in cages or anything, but we've all heard of people getting hooked on a drug after just one hit, right? Haven't you?
After all, these are just rats and more simple creatures than humans.
Well, speaking of getting hooked on a drug after just one hit, while talking to Bruce Alexander in Vancouver, Johann met a doctor there named Gabor Mate, who explained something that got Johann thinking.
If I step out of here today, after this interview, and I'm hit by a car and I break my hip, I'll be taken to hospital and I'll be given a lot of diamorphine for the pain. Diamorphine is heroin. It's much stronger heroin than I can ever buy on the streets, because the stuff that drug dealers sell you is mostly contaminants, whereas obviously the stuff you get in hospital is medically pure. Anyone listening to this, there's loads of people near you being given diamorphine in hospital.
So if diamorphine is just the medical name for pure heroin, and if what we have believed up until this point about drugs causing drug addiction is right,
a lot of those people should, at least some of them, should leave hospital as heroin addicts, right? This has been studied very carefully. That doesn't happen. You may have noticed your grandmother was not turned into a junkie by her hip replacement operation, right?
Well, I never thought about it that way. So someone who gets hooked after one hit of a drug could get off the drug with something like a rat park for addicts? Like a super fun jail?
well, not quite. There's more to this than just that. Gabor Mate, the doctor Johann mentioned, was born to a Jewish family at the height of the Holocaust in Hungary. Before his mother was killed, she chose to give him away to a Christian stranger to protect him from genocide. Many years later,
Gabor ended up living on the downtown east side of Vancouver, which is has one of the highest concentrations of addicts anywhere in the world. And Gabor started working with very, very extreme addicts. And he really wanted to listen to them. And he started giving them talking therapy along with other forms of support. And what Gabor noticed was something very striking, that all the addicts who he worked with, really without exception, the extreme addicts, had had horrific childhoods, like abuse, physical, sexual, extreme neglect, and so on. Far more than could be like any attributed by chance, right?
And Dr. Mate also worried that there was some kind of addiction within him. I mean, this guy would sometimes abandon patients while looking after them, like a woman in the middle of labor, and he'd run out and compulsively buy CDs and even listen to. And he didn't understand why.
Why would childhood trauma be such a strong correlation with the addicts around him?
and this is what a Santa Barbara physician named Dr. Vincent Felitti stumbled upon.
He wanted to understand the causes of obesity, and particularly the psychological causes. He noticed that a lot of his very obese patients had also had childhood trauma. And he started studying people. And what they did is they would ask people about 10 different traumatic things that can happen to a child, right? So from sexual abuse, death of a parent, that kind of thing. And then it saw how strong a correlation is there between that trauma and your odds of being obese. So it asked about childhood traumatic experiences, and it asked about all sorts of different adult dysfunctions, from extreme obesity to addiction, that kind of thing.
And what Dr. Felidi's studies found were that for every traumatic event a child experienced, they were 2 to 4 times more likely to grow up an injecting drug user.
And if you had 6 of these categories of traumatic experiences, you were 4,000 times more likely to grow up to be an injecting drug user than someone who had had none of these traumatic experiences.
I mean, it's very rare in medical science you get a correlation that high. And of course, this helped Gabor to understand his own behaviour. Well, why was he behaving in this addictive compulsive way? He had, of course, had an extreme childhood trauma.
A test was developed from the results of this study called ACE, or Adverse Childhood Experiences Test. You can look it up and take it online. It's pretty enlightening. Anyway.
I actually got to know Gabor and Bruce Alexander, who did the rat pocket experiment at the same time, because they're both based in Vancouver, and I went there for some time to get to know them. And at first I thought, are these like incompatible theories? On one hand, you've got the rat park theory, which says that addiction is caused to a significant degree by isolation and disconnection. And on the other hand, you've got Gabor's theory, which talks about how it's caused by childhood trauma. But actually, I increasingly came to think of Gabor's theory as like a subset of Bruce's theory, because actually, if you think about a survivor of childhood trauma, one of the things that's true of a huge number of survivors of childhood trauma is you find it much harder to trust the world. You find it much harder to form connections. Of course, you can overcome it if you work hard. You know, if the world has treated you very badly at a very formative age, it's harder to believe that people are going to treat you well and to trust them. So you're much more likely to be isolated. You're more likely to be socially and emotionally inside yourself, more like those rats in that first cage who are cut off, and less like those rats in Rat Park that are very bonded and connected. If isolation is a massive driver of addiction, childhood trauma means you're much more likely to grow up to be an isolated adult.
Now, if you accept that, Bruce Alexander says it means both the right-wing and the left-wing theories about addiction are wrong.
The right-wing theory is it's a moral failing. You're a hedonist, you party too hard, that's why you use. The left-wing theory is your brain gets hijacked, you get taken over. Bruce says, to a much larger degree than we've understood up to now, addiction isn't about your morality and it isn't about your brain. It's about your cage.
Which also means that addiction is an adaptation to your environment. Cohen is a professor in the Netherlands at the Universiteit van Amsterdam, as well as director of the First Amsterdam Drug Research Program and director of CEDRO, C-E-D-R-O, the Center for Drug Research. Cohen says,
let's use the word bonding. Human beings have an innate need to bond, and when we're happy and healthy, we will bond with the people around us. We'll form nourishing relationships with the people around us. But when you can't do that because you're traumatized or beaten down by life or physically isolated or mentally isolated, you will bond with something that gives you some sense of relief. Now, that might be gambling, that might be pornography, that might be cocaine, but you'll bond with something that gives you some sense of relief, because human beings are creatures that need to bond. A really key aspect of addiction is not wanting to be present in your life, not finding your life bearable. One of the most striking human examples actually happened at the same time as Rat Park. It's called the Vietnam War. In Vietnam, about 20% of American troops were using a lot of heroin. 95% of them came home and just stopped. Didn't go to rehab, didn't get any help, they just stopped.
With the old theory of addiction, that doesn't make any sense, because the drug is supposed to be able to hijack you and make you its slave.
If you understand Bruce's theory of addiction, it makes perfect sense. Because if you're taken out of a hellish pestilential jungle where you could be killed at any moment, and you go back to your nice life in Wichita, Kansas with your friends and your family and your job and your meaning,
then life becomes more bearable, and wanting to be present in it comes more naturally.
We can even get addicted to things that aren't powerful chemical drugs.
Are we talking about my previous addictions to Minesweeper and Tetris? I used to have dreams about them, and I would catch myself playing them when I felt anxious about something.
Wait, you aren't playing Tetris right now, are you? Is that a Game Boy in your hand?
Take gambling, for instance. During the research of his book, Johann went to Las Vegas to understand gambling addiction, and he sat in on Gamblers Anonymous meetings.
And it was very striking to me that that meeting of Gamblers Anonymous was exactly like every meeting of Narcotics Anonymous I've ever been to, right? Like, it was indistinguishable. They were as much addicts as any smack addict I've ever known. Yet no one thinks you snort a roulette wheel or you don't inject craps, right? And so I think that tells you something about addiction. If you can have all of the addiction and none of the chemicals, that tells us that we have massively overrated the role that chemicals play and massively underrated all these other factors. It's not to say that chemicals play no role, and I think that's important to stress. We actually know how much they play.
For example, Johann's research for his book, Chasing the Scream, shows that for nicotine, 17% of addiction is caused by the drug, but 83% is caused by non-chemical factors. And when we talk about recovering from a substance, generally speaking, the focus is zoomed in on just that person.
But Johann believes the focus should be much wider.
In addiction, we talk a lot about individual recovery, and that has some value. But we need to think much more about social recovery. Something has gone wrong with us, not just as individuals, but as a group. And we've created a society and a culture where for a lot of people, life looks a whole lot more like that first cage where the rats are isolated and distressed, and a lot less like Rat Park. We've created a society where just lots of people don't want to be present in their lives. And I think we have to change our societies and the way we live. We live in a very unnatural way, with people being massively cut off from each other, massively stressed. And as Gabor Mate said to me, we are trained from the moment we're born by advertising, by the whole culture we live in, to think that the solution to our problems comes from buying and consuming things. That's the whole mentality of our culture. We're judged constantly on that basis. That's what our economies are built on making us do. And in a way, drug addiction is just a kind of misfiring of the things that we're taught, the way we're taught to think about the world, and also this kind of empty, materialist way we're taught to think about ourselves. We're trained to seek meaning in things that we all know at some level don't give you any meaning. So you've got an expensive car, so you've got a big house, you've got some stupid designer label. We're trained to valorize those things and to think they're where we find. Everyone knows at some level you're not going to be lying on your deathbed thinking, what a great life I had an expensive car and I had a Versace suit, right? But we're trained to meaningless materialist distractions to dominate our consciousness. And I think it's one of the reasons why we're so unhappy.
If our focus is transfixed on the objects in our lives, the attention spent on people falls away.
Before we know it, we've jumped on a hedonic treadmill, keeping up with the Joneses, chasing a carrot on a stick.
The belief that those objects will somehow satiate our true desires for bonding, for love, keeps us forever running toward objects that can't love us back. We may run consciously or unconsciously.
But in the end, our focus on things instead of relationships means we keep running away from true authentic connection, with people who actually could love us back.
So what if we invested that energy somewhere else?
What if the institutions that are designed to deal with addiction invested their resources in different ways?
So I think it's important to understand how much these social factors are drivers of addiction. And if we really want to deal with addiction, there are things we can do with drug policy. We can spend the money on helping addicts to turn their lives around instead of spending the money on making them worse. But I think the overall we need a bigger social change. I also think it has implications for how the people listening to this who have addicts in their lives might want to think about this. You know, one of the reasons why I think this is so charged is because it runs through the hearts of each of us, right? The drug war runs through all of us. Every bit of us has a drug warrior in our hearts and a compassionate person in our hearts. And, you know, I was always in favour of more compassionate drug policies, but if I'm honest, particularly when I started on this journey, with the addicts in my life and the people I loved, a lot of the time I was really angry. And there was a part of me that did look at them and think, I wish someone would just stop you.
Just like our storyteller from part 1, wishing her father would stay in jail forever, that he'd go away from her life and leave her be. And sometimes that may be the best thing for a relationship. But
I do think there's an element to which we need to think about helping everyone to connect with their humanity. And we all have moments of our humanity being cauterized, and we all have blocks on our compassion, and we all have times when we can't connect or won't connect. And I think it's useful to try to extend your compassion to people who've done terrible things, but also it's useful to identify the similarities we all have. One of the things that really helped me to know with the addicts in my life, and it's very hard and I can't do it a lot of the time, but what it made me determined to say to the addicts in my life is, I'll just try and sit with you, and I love you, and whether you're clean or whether you're not, I love you all just the same. And what it made me resolve to do was to strengthen the connections with the addicts in my life, not make them contingent or threatened, because, you know, that's the lesson of Rat Park, that's the lesson of everything I learned. Insecurity isn't going to help anyone. Helping them to turn their lives around is going to help them.
Connection is why we're here. We are hardwired to connect with others. It's what gives purpose and meaning to our lives. And without it, there is suffering. Brené Brown.
What if we tried on this concept? If we worked on strengthening the connections with the addicts in our life in a different way?
what if we just sat with them without trying to fix them or control their behavior or rescue them?
If we could be with them in a way that was strong and healthy, that supported our own autonomy, but still gave them the connection that they need.
But what happens when loving an addict puts you in danger? Because at best, addicts are annoying, selfish and narcissistic, demanding and self-destructive. At worst, they're a devastation to most anything that surrounds them.
Our young storyteller from part 1 of this series and the start of this episode found a way to preserve herself above all else. She was fortunate enough to have the incredible support from her mom and grandparents, and they enabled her to keep herself intact during the challenging moments that addiction brought to her life.
She was able to avoid the dark hooks of codependency and steer her future in the direction of authenticity. In the next year of her life, after her story took place, she found herself in the throes of a powerful best friendom. and among a group of peers that gave her deeply satisfying connections. She no longer relies on just one band to find emotional resonance in. She says it's now closer to like 500.
Her mother has always been the rock she needed and is addiction-free. Well, except perhaps for coffee. Her father was humbled by the car crash he caused and quit drinking alcohol for many months. During that time, he made more efforts to reconnect and repair the relationship with his daughter. And she was as open as protecting her safety would allow for.
Her dad has since returned to bonding with a relationship that brings him relief from the stresses burdening his psychic existence. One that's been there for him since childhood. One that gives him a sense of freedom from the troubles that mount. No, not the love of another person or even a new hobby. He's still bonding with his friend in a bottle, beer. Not as much as before his accident, but it's still enough to make you wonder, will he recover?
She's starting to have problems, emotional problems. And I didn't have empathy because I was like, you don't know what going through problems are, kind of a feeling. Yes, I lacked and still lack empathy because I guess I feel like if you walk a mile in my shoes, you'd know what I'm going through.
We'll hear his story next in the final episode in this series, Addiction Bonding Part 3.
Big thanks to Eric Zimmer at the One You Feed podcast for letting us recraft this transformative interview. If you like this piece, you should check out his extended version, loaded with more interesting content at oneyoufeed.net.
And a big thank you to Johann Hari, who allowed us to reinterpret this interview per our discretion. If this topic interests you, you can dig into his work through his new book, Chasing the Scream, The First and Last Days of the War on Drugs. And you can also follow him on Twitter at Johann Hari 101. That's JOHANNHARI 101. Generous support for this episode was provided by Sam A. Mowry. His voice talents can be heard across the world via the internet, and he also directs the Willamette Radio Workshop. It's dedicated to the creation and preservation of the fine art of radio storytelling. Find out more about Sam at voiceofsam.com and check out the workshop's fantastic recreations of radio theater and reimaginings of classic radio programs. They're at radiowork.com.
Storied Sounds is a production of the In-Story Creatives. From professional level editing to social media marketing, In-Story provides a full suite of services to make your podcast great. Whether you're a new podcast just getting started or ready to take your podcast to NPR quality, In-Story can help. For a way better podcast, check them out at instorycreatives.com.